time, I would yield to the distinguished member from the state of Virginia, Mr. Robert Bobby Scott.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank the gentlelady from Ohio for organizing this special order. The budget is an extremely important part of our work, and I thank you for allowing us the opportunity to discuss what's going on with the budget. Before we can discuss the budget going forward, we have to understand where we are and the mess that we're in, and sometimes you need charts to adequately describe exactly what the situation is. This is a chart showing from 1989, the budget deficit. Starting in 93, we went up to surplus, and unfortunately in 2001, we had a complete collapse of the budget. 2008, the deficit will be about here, a little over $400 billion. 2009 will literally be off the chart. So this is what we're dealing with. In 1993, we made the tough choices, eliminated the deficit, went into surplus, and had enough in the beginning of 2001, enough of a surplus to pay Social Security for 75 years without reducing any benefits, or to pay off the entire debt held by the public by last year. We were in good shape financially in 2001, but we made the wrong choices, and the rest is history. The deterioration in the budget from the $5.5 trillion surplus to the probably $3, maybe $4 trillion deficit was a swing of almost $9 trillion, almost $1 trillion a year, deterioration in the budget. This chart shows where the the public debt has exploded. In 2001, we were headed by the budget projections to paying off not only the debt held by the public, but all of the debt, putting the money back in the trust funds and everything else. Instead, the debt has totally exploded. Now, one of the problems with the debt is that more and more of it is coming from foreign countries, primarily Saudi Arabia, Japan, and China, and that has foreign policy implications. You can't negotiate a good trade deal when the next thing out of your mouth is, can I borrow some money? When you're borrowing money from Saudi Arabia, obviously that has implications on our ability to negotiate gasoline and oil prices. The debt held in foreign countries was headed towards zero. It has again exploded. Now we have over $2 trillion of our debt held in foreign countries. Now we got in this mess because we had unaffordable tax cuts primarily for the wealthy. Now people get mad when you say primarily for the wealthy, but it was done presumably to create jobs. This chart shows how in the last 8 years, in terms of job growth, we've experienced the worst job growth since the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover is the only president on this chart who's done worse than the last 8 years. There's very poor economic activity as measured by the Dow Jones Industrial Average. This chart shows the Dow Jones Industrial Average from Hoover, Franklin Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, the worst since Herbert Hoover in terms of Dow performance in the last 8 years. Now, some people have said that all those tax cuts actually increased revenues. Well, that's not exactly true. Since 1960, this chart, just to break down the color code, a green bar is a year in which we achieved record revenues in individual income tax. Record revenues. A red bar is one where a record was not achieved. You'll notice since 1960, tax cuts, tax increases, recessions, depression, everything since good years, bad years. Since 1960, there are only 2 years in which we did not achieve a record. So to say that we had additional revenues wouldn't be saying much, because we always have revenues, but it's even worse than that. Because in 2001, we did not achieve a record. 2002, 2003, 2004, and 2005, we went 5 consecutive years, something that has not happened since they started taking records in 1930s. Did you go more than 2 years without achieving a record? You've had world wars and everything else. The record, 5 years without a record. So the cuts in taxes did not increase revenues, it actually decreased revenues. And as I said, they get mad when you say the taxes were cut for the rich. This chart shows for people under 20,000, from 20,000 to 50,000, 50,000, 75,000, 75 to 100, 100 to 200, 200,000 to $1 million, over $1 million, how much you got out of the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts. You notice if you made over $1 million, you did well, and if you made under $20,000 or even under $50,000, you hardly need ink to draw the bar. There's one particular tax that in the Obama budget will be repealed, put back the way it was. It's about a $20 billion tax cut every year, and this is how it's distributed. If you make over $1 million, you get about $17,000. 200,000 to $1 million, you get several $100s. 100,000 to 200,000 on average, you'll get about $1 a month. And under $100,000 on average, you'll get not a dime. Now, one of the things that is extremely important and why it is crucial that we get this budget under control, and that is, I referred to Social Security. This is the Social Security cash flow chart showing the blue bars. We're bringing in now more than we're paying out. In 2017, we'll start paying out more than we're bringing in. This is $200 billion deficit, $600 billion deficit. By 2040, we'll be approaching $1 trillion paying out more Social Security than we're bringing in. If we had the $5.5 trillion, you needed about $4 trillion in the bank today drawing interest. We could pay Social Security for 75 years without reducing benefits. Unfortunately, we're going broke, and this is one of the reasons we have to get our budget under control quickly, because otherwise we'll get into a deficit situation in Social Security that we'll never get out of. One of the things that we have to do is make sure that the expenditures and tax revenues get back under control. Federal revenues traditionally in the past have been less than the expenditures. We've been spending more than we've been bringing in. That's deficit spending. By the mid-1990s, we actually reduced spending and increased revenues to the point where we had that healthy surplus that was set to go as far as the eye could see. Unfortunately, in 2001, we passed tax cuts that we could not afford, collapsing revenues, and in fact even increased as a percentage of GDP, increased spending, creating this deficit. We have to get back under control where the revenues are more than the expenditures. This year we're out of control because we've had the stimulus package, we've had the bailouts and everything, but this is just a one-year spike, and we need to get the budget back under control. And we can do that. Under the Obama budgets, we'll be back into more traditional levels of deficits. But when we get down here, that should not be the end. That's just the first step. We're going to have to continue bringing spending down and revenues up so that we'll have a surplus so that we'll be able to afford Social Security. The President's budget, first thing it does is reinstates what's called pay-go. One of the reasons that we could maintain fiscal responsibility in the 1990s is we had a process called pay-go, pay as you go. If you offer a spending program, you have to pay for it. You have to raise the taxes to pay for it, or cut some spending somewhere else. If you want to cut some taxes, you have to cut some spending, or raise some other taxes. Everything you do, you have to pay for it. And if you don't pay for it, you can't pass it. Unfortunately, in 2001, pay-go expired. and the tax cuts were passed without paying for it. Increased spending took place without paying for it, and we got into the ditch that we're in. We now are back under pay-go, where we're going to have to pay for what we do. One of the things that the Obama budget does, it presents an honest budget. There are many things in the last few budgets that were just kind of left out. We knew every year we'd been continuing some tax cuts year after year, and we knew each year we'd put those back in. Those weren't in the budget that was introduced. The war spending. We knew we were at war. There was zero for the war in Iraq and Afghanistan in the budgets as introduced. We knew we were going to spend some money on those wars. In fact, there were about $250 billion worth of known expenditures that we knew we were going to spend that were left out of the budgets. The Obama budget includes everything that everybody knows that we're going to spend. So with pay-go and fiscal responsibility, we're going to at least reduce the deficit 50% in the first term of President Obama, and after we get there, we will continue to make progress. The President's budget makes significant investments in energy, getting us from dependence from foreign oil and creating millions of jobs in energy, creating clean energy jobs. His budget brings down the skyrocketing costs of health care and makes focused investments in education. One of the things on energy, alternative forms of energy, and conservation and significant research investments. In health care, we need to make investments in cost control to make sure that we can control health care. The Social Security chart and the Medicare chart are very similar. But the Medicare chart is actually even worse because of the accelerating health care costs. We need to get those costs under control, because if we don't get Medicare under control, health care generally will consume the entire budget. We need to make sure that we're investing in access to make sure that those who have insurance can keep it, because as the costs go up, people are losing their health insurance. He's making significant investments in education, making sure that education tax credits for education expenses are increased, and Pell Grants are increased, so more and more people can go to college. And we want to make sure that we invest in elementary and secondary education, particularly early childhood education. The budget makes a unique investment in nurse home visits. These have been shown to significantly reduce a lot of problems, one of which is child abuse, which is highly correlated with future crime. By these nurse visits have been studied, and they have found, I serve on the Judiciary Committee, they have found that those who have had the advantage of the nurse visits were 1/3 as likely to be arrested 18 years later as those that did not have the visits. Education is much better off. Child abuse is down. And so those visits will be a very important investment in our future. And finally, the President's budget continues large increases in veterans' health care. We had significant increases 2 years ago and last year, and we will continue those increases so our veterans get the health care that they certainly have earned and deserve. We need to make some tough choices. The President says one of the most difficult choices are making expenditures today that save money in the future. Nobody wants to spend the money today if the savings won't occur for 5 or 10 years. One of the bills that I've introduced is the Youth Promise Act that makes investments in young people to keep them out of trouble. We're spending more money per person in incarceration. We've got more people locked up today per 100,000 population than anywhere on earth. We could significantly reduce the need for that incarceration if we made investments up front, getting young people on the right track and keeping them on the right track. The Youth Promise Act does that. It has an interesting aspect to it. When you save money, the localities that come up with their local plans will try to identify where they're saving money, and those agencies should kick in to keep the program running. The state of Pennsylvania did the collaborative approach that's anticipated in the Youth Promise Act, and they funded a number of programs for a total cost of approximately $60 million. $60 million, and they calculate they saved over the next few years over $300 million because they made those investments and reduced crime significantly. So nobody wants to make the first investment. So the Youth Promise Act will make those investments, and hopefully the localities will continue the programs, saving significant money in the future. But we have to make the tough choices. We need to, and if we don't make those tough choices, if we don't get the budget under control, we're going to be spending entirely too much money on interest on the national debt. We will jeopardize Social Security and Medicare. But with the leadership of President Obama, the Congressional Black Caucus is committed to addressing our priorities in a fiscally responsible way. Our Social Security, Medicare, and our future depend on it. Again, I want to thank the gentlelady from Ohio for her leadership and giving us the opportunity to talk about the budget today. I yield back.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, I'd like to thank the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Bobby Scott. For those of us in the Congressional Black Caucus, we clearly know that Representative Scott is the best in the Congress when it comes to analyzing budgets and providing information to his colleagues. So again, I thank him.